family systems is essentially, it starts with, if you've heard of Murray Bowen and Edwin Friedman, and they talk about the essential formation of a person is in the family, and it's kind of reflected in larger groups of people. And it talks about how anxiety is transmitted and works within a family system, and how it's very fluid. And so we'll go over some of that. So before we get started, so when we're talking about family systems, it's very easy to understand from an outsider's perspective. It's easy to kind of notice some of the things that we'll go over. But the hardest part of family systems is applying it to yourself. And so it's going to be kind of the knowing who you are and all that stuff. It's the hardest and longest journey that you'll ever have. So, so some of the ground rules is that family systems deals with kind of with your family. So only share what you feel comfortable with. This isn't a therapy session. So just... well, I mean, family systems is used in therapy a lot, but just be mindful. It's also being recorded, so just don't overshare. But boundaries are an important part of family systems too. Personal stories, just whatever you share here, just try to keep it within the group. And if you don't have answers, part of when we're learning family systems, part of it is that you learn as you go, and sometimes you'll maybe learn something here, and then maybe months down the road you're like, oh, I finally get it, and that's okay. And we're going to be moving pretty fast, so just if you need me to stop, let me know. But just also know that like family systems, there's lots of books, and I'll kind of give you some resources to use, but it's a lifetime worth of study stuff. So, and then also just as we go home, just kind of pray and think about all the stuff that you learned today and how it can maybe help you in the future. Some key terms. You'll hear the term homeostasis a lot. If you're familiar with that, is the tendency towards a relatively stable equilibrium between interdependent elements, especially as maintained by the psychological processes. And those are behaviors of patterns of behavior and roles and functions within the family. And just and when we talk about stress and anxiety, anything that causes change within the system, that's stress and anxiety. So and those are kind of two key things to understand as we get started. One of the first things we're going to talk about is the family canoe. A great analogy when we talk about family systems is the family canoe, and how every person has a role or position within the boat. When people stand up or they get out or they move around, it affects the balance of, is the boat tipping this way or that way, or is it, the back heavier, the front heavier, all that stuff. When somebody adds or leaves the boat, it causes a lot of stress and anxiety. When somebody decides I want to be the rear end, I want to steer the canoe now, that changes things and affects the balance. And then as in a canoe, if you're traveling down the river, the way the river runs and the currents and stuff, that changes the way things happen too. And then we also are in different boats, in different canoes, in various aspects of our life and throughout different times. So there's lots of these different things going on. So if you could imagine your canoe, imagine being in a canoe or at your family dinner table with your immediate family. So what role does each person have in your family? Who's in charge? Who's a jokester? Who's the most trusted? What happens during stressful moments in your life? Who gets blamed? How do you all fight? Did things change? And what do you do when you're stressed? And how does this affect your family? You kind of, I think we have a good basis for us to start with, kind of understanding how we're thinking. Let us take this moment to pray and invite the Holy Spirit. Lord, we thank you for inviting us into your family, that through Jesus that we are invited into your presence. Help us to understand our own families and ourselves so that we can model your love towards all those around us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So there's a video. This is kind of a synopsis of differentiated leadership, which is kind of the basis of family systems. And if you don't understand some of the terms or things, we're gonna kind of go over them again. But this is kind of a helpful introduction. So see, there's some of the basic concepts. So when you're talking about yourself, if you think of yourself as a cell, and you have your true self and your pseudo self. And so your true self is kind of the core being of who you are. And the pseudo self is kind of the image you present to others and how others see you. And when you talk about fusion is kind of the amount in which you allow others people's identity to kind of increep on yours. I think a great example of fusion is your spouse. Because, you know, when you get married and you've been with someone long enough, if someone insults your spouse, you take it personally. And so it's kind of like they're hurting you. I mean, it's the same way with kids, you know, the old, you know, your mama jokes, I mean, are a great example of fusion. And also how kids, their identities are rooted in their family. And so it's not a bad thing, but as we grow more mature, we hopefully would have a stronger sense of true self, and kind of that pseudo self, that the image we try to present would be, you'd have a little bit more control over kind of the boundary of what that is for you. When we're talking about kind of understanding self-differential scale, if you're completely self-differentiated, that's not healthy either. So, because we thrive on having relationships with others, and you can't have a relationship if you don't allow some kind of them to be a part of you. So, especially so you look at the kind of the top, the healthy sense. You have a stronger sense of self, and a kind of the pseudo self, and there's kind of a little bit less fusion parts, and so you have a strong sense of self. You're less dependent on others for emotional support or validation. You're able to separate emotional issues from other people, from yourselves, so you have that non-anxious presence. And usually there's less drama. You know, you can usually you know, it talks about, you know, some people just invite drama into their lives. I mean, that's an example of someone who's maybe poorly differentiated, because they allow all that anxiety. Yeah, I mean, a lot of maturity, it comes with age, and then some of it just depends on which system that you're in, because sometimes, you know, like if you're a school teacher, sometimes you just kind of learn how to be a little bit more self-differentiated when you're at school because you need to survive. But then when you're at home, like, you kind of maybe slide back a few notches. And it's not necessarily, this isn't like a grading scale in terms of like bad or wrong, but it's more like what is healthy for you and what's unhealthy. So, and hopefully, I guess some of this stuff is hard to understand, but hopefully the kind of visuals kind of help you kind of understand it. I'm going to pass out some rubber bands. So if you kind of grab one, we're going to do a kind of an exercise. If you're working with the church council, this is a great exercise to kind of think about when you're dealing with anxiety. You know, so if you have, you stretch out your rubber band, right? There's lots of tension. So like, imagine, you're stretching it out. That's anxiety that happens, right? And so you have some options when you're dealing with anxiety. You can go back to the way things were, or you can move forward into a kind of a new direction, or you can cut the rubber band, right? And so that's how we deal with anxiety. And so like I took, there's kind of some things that happen, closeness and cutoff, or as I like to call emotional physics. So as you're dealing with anxiety and trying to deal with change, you can either kind of change the patterns of behavior and it becomes a new normal, which is good. You can release stress so you can go back to the way things were. This happens a lot in, especially when you're dealing with addicts. Is that a person who's dealing with stress, and if the people around him aren't willing to kind of help him develop new patterns of behavior or her, that they'll go back to what they did. And so especially that's why family systems is kind of important when we're talking about with addiction, is that it's not just a person who has addiction that has a problem, it's the system as well. And so it's important to kind of help other people around them move to new patterns of behavior. And then we have kind of cutoff and distance. So whenever people are in kind of stressful situations, sometimes they'll just cut themselves off. Like they'll say, I'm not going to talk to you, and then that's done. Sometimes they'll maybe like, I need 5 minutes to just be over here by myself, and they'll come back, and they can deal with it. But
is it a good thing?
It depends on what's healthy for you. Ideally, like when you have cut off can be healthy, but there are times that if you don't learn how to deal with the stress, if you cut off, that anxiety can still linger. This happens a lot with families who've had estranged family members, that there's all this anxiety that's still there, and then they just kind of leave, and that it's never dealt with. So that's an unhealthy example of cutoff. Sometimes you have to have cutoff, like an abusive relationship. Like that's the only way that you can kind of get rid of the anxiety.
Is it the same time as time off? You need to...
I would say cutoff, I think, is a little bit more permanent, and a little bit more abrupt. Whereas distance is kind of distance is a little bit. They're basically the same thing, but they're just a little slightly different. But distance is more like, I need like 5 minutes, or distance is knowing that the anxiety still lingers, but you know that you're going to try to deal with it eventually. Cutoff is like, we're done. And so people go through different cycles of this, and sometimes those cycles can be really bad. It's like kiss and make up. Get angry, and so there's. When we talk about family systems, we always want to kind of, we want things in terms of, is this healthy? Are these healthy habits of kind of, being really stressed and then distancing and then coming back to being more stressed? Or just kind of in terms of your own personal health, it varies a lot among people. But it's just, family systems is learning to understand these patterns for yourselves and for others, and you can see it, and then you can do something about it when you know what's happening. And there's it's a cycle within any relationships. And then emotional triangles. This is probably one of the most familiar things when people talk about being triangulated. You want to avoid triangles. You don't want to rope other people into your stress. So if you have I have it here, you have the third person will always get the blunt of the problem. So as a third person, you're going to be usually, a third person within a triangle will usually ask to take a side. And so if you want to be, if people somehow rope you in, you want to remain neutral and encourage direct communication between the two people who have kind of roped you in. This is what therapy is for a lot of people, is that it's a neutral third party who, helps you communicate with the other person. And so like triangles happen. Sometimes you just can't avoid them. The thing is to not use them as a way of manipulation. and also to recognize when people are using triangles to manipulate you. And sometimes, whether you like it or not, is that sometimes the third person is going to be you, and learning how to deal with that is difficult. So there's some great biblical examples of Moses, when Moses was kind of dealing with Israel. That's like a great triangle to kind of explore, especially with our relationship with God, Jesus. So like when you're talking about conflicts, like when distance and cutoff. I mean, it's kind of we'll get there, but So trying and sometimes you do need a third person. Triangles, they're not always bad. I would say most of the time they probably are, but sometimes it's helpful to have a neutral party, kind of ask questions and kind of give you a perspective to help you see some of these other concepts, things that happen.
I understand yours.
So we're talking about family systems. So it all comes back to the family. So how we understand God is related to our view of our parents. The first image or concept of a child has of God is their parent, because when they cry, the parent comes and soothes them, and of other things. So how is God like your parents, or maybe how is God different? How is your view of God changed since maybe you were little to? I read someplace was that patterns of unhappiness or kindness can be transmitted from generation to generation. I mean, some of you probably know that there's a family that's just bitter about everything, and then there are some families that are they're very kind and genuine, and the Bible talks about it. The generations who are kindness will be blessed forever and ever, and so. Sometimes when you're looking at people and the way that behave, sometimes you just need to understand where they come from. There's patterns of over-functioning and under-functioning. These are like kind of responsibilities within a relationship. A great example is my dad would usually come home and he'd watch TV, and my mom would cook dinner, and so that's kind of the pattern that when we got married, that's kind of what had kind of happened. And now that my wife is going back to work, we're having to figure that out, and we have to do something different that is not what my parents did. So and those type of things happen. And so usually when people are stressed, they they revert back to that kind of pattern of over or under functioning. And you can usually tell if you're an over-functioner if you're trying to do everything rather than letting other people do stuff. And usually if you're an under-functioner, you don't want to admit it. There's that. And then there's also kind of projection, which you're probably familiar with. If you're sitting in church council, I think most people, they try to recreate what their family system that they had around the dinner table. And so if someone looks like their mother, they assume that person is their mother, and that's how they behave. But it happens sometimes. When you're a little bit more differentiated, you recognize that, and you're able to maybe do something different. But for a lot of people, they try to recreate If you grew up with a lot of drama around the table, that's usually the type of environment that you try to recreate when you're with other groups. And I guess another example is if you have kids, do you place your own goals and dreams on them as opposed to letting them have their own dreams? And then the last point is a system is a system. And so all these kind of different concepts and things, like they're all happening at the same time and kind of converging and interacting with each other. Sometimes it's hard to realize that. Like you learn one concept and then you realize, oh, this other thing's happening at the same time, and it's all interconnected. So it took me a little while to kind of understand how it all works together. And so a system is fluid, so everybody's level of kind of maturity and self-differentiation and how they react to anxiety, it's affected by time and place and the people you're around and the amount of stress you have. So, and you and everyone else around you is a work in progress. And so when we're talking about systems thinking, a lot it's good to help you understand other people, but for our purposes, I'd hope that it's primarily a tool of self-discovery. That it just kind of, it gives you an opportunity to maybe understand yourself a little bit better. Because the only person in the system that you can change is you. And then when you're dealing with family problems, I mean, you can really only change yourself, but when you're dealing with family problems, it helps to help other people kind of know this is what I'm dealing with. And so don't expect others to fix your issues. You aren't prepared to work with yourself. So if you're going to ask somebody, I mean, I bring up kind of addiction again. You know, if somebody's dealing with addiction, like I hope that maybe you look a little bit at yourself and how maybe you're contributing to that and how you're helping. You know, because we can't do this on our own.
So I have a question.
Yes.
Because the name of this group was called Church as a Family System. So how are we supposed to take a look at ourselves and how we relate to our church family, or how to improve our church family?
I don't know. I would say changing your church family. I think if you know how you react, knowing yourself means that you can be a non-anxious presence. And so when anxieties come up, you can identify, well, maybe that person is really anxious, and you can be, maybe that's the person that I need to address. And having the tools to kind of understand what's happening within your church.
It's really hard sometimes in the church family to deal with the viruses.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of toxic sometimes,
Yeah.
and can actually break the church.
Yeah.
It's just that third person question that I've learned to very neutrally say, really? Why? Or ask him where is Jesus in this?
Right. Except that in
Well, that those are difficult questions. I don't have an answer for you. I do have a fable. Friedman, who wrote Failure of Nerve, he has a wonderful book that has, I think, 12 or 14 kind of little stories that help you think about family systems in a new way. And there's this one story. It's The Friendly Forest. And it deals with how do you deal with someone who's kind of a jerk. You know, and what does that look like? So we can listen
Fables by Edwin H. Friedman. Section 1, The Failure of Syntax. Chapter 3, The Friendly Forest. Once upon a time in the friendly forest there lived a lamb who loved to graze and frolic about. One day a tiger came to the forest and said to the animals, "I would like to live among you." They were delighted, for unlike some of the other forests, they had no tiger in their woods. The lamb, however, had some apprehensions, which, being a lamb, she sheepishly expressed to her friends. "But," said they, "do not worry. We will talk to the tiger and explain that one of the conditions for living in this forest is that you must also let the other animals live in the forest." So the lamb went about her life as usual, but it was not long before the tiger began to growl and make threatening gestures and menacing motions. Each time the frightened lamb went to her friends and said, "It is very uncomfortable for me here in the forest," but her friends reassured her, "Do not worry, that's just the way tigers behave." Every day, as she went about her life, the lamb tried to remember this advice, hoping that the tiger would find someone else to growl at. And it is probably correct to say that the tiger did not really spend all or even most of its time stalking the lamb. Still, the lamb found it increasingly difficult to remove the tiger from her thoughts. Sometimes she would just catch it out of the corner of her eye, but that seemed enough to disconcert her for the day, even if the giant cat were asleep. Soon, the lamb found that she was actually looking for the tiger. Sometimes days or even weeks went by between its intrusive actions, yet somehow the tiger had succeeded in always being there. Eventually, the tiger's existence became a part of the lamb's existence. When she tried to explain this to her friends, however, they pointed out that no harm had really befallen her, and that perhaps she was just being too sensitive. So the lamb again tried to put the tiger out of her mind. Why, she said to herself, should I let my relationship with just one member of the forest ruin my relationships with all the others? But every now and then, usually when she was least prepared, the tiger would give her another start. Finally, the lamb couldn't take it anymore. She decided that as much as she loved the forest and her friends, more than she had ever loved any other forest or friends, the cost was just too great. So she went to the other animals in the woods and said goodbye. Her friends would not hear of it. This is silly, they said. Nothing has even happened. You're still in one piece. You must remember that a tiger is a tiger, they repeated. Surely, this is the nicest forest in the world. You know, we really like you very much. We would be very sad if you left. Though it must be admitted that several of the animals were wondering what the lamb might be doing to contribute to the tiger's aggressiveness. Then, said two of the animals in the friendly forest, surely this whole thing can be worked out. We're all reasonable here. Let's just stay calm. There is probably just some misunderstanding that can easily be resolved if we all just sit down together and communicate. The lamb, however, had several misgivings about such a meeting. First of all, if her friends had explained away the tiger's behavior by saying it was simply a tiger's nature to behave that way, why did they now think that as a result of communication, the tiger would be able to change its nature? And second, thought the lamb, such meetings, well-intentioned as they might be, usually try to resolve problems through compromise. Now, while the tiger might appear to growl less, might agree to growl less, and indeed might succeed in reducing some of its aggressive behavior, what would she, the lamb, be expected to give up in return? Be more accepting of the tiger's growling? There was something wrong with this, thought the lamb, with the notion that an agreement is equal if the invasive creature agrees to be less invasive and the invaded one agrees to tolerate some invasiveness. She tried to explain this to her friends, but being reasonable animals, they assured her that the more important thing was to just keep communicating. Perhaps the tiger didn't understand the ways of a lamb. Don't be so sheepish, they said. Speak up strongly when it does these things. Though one of the less subtle animals in the forest, more uncouth in expression and unconcerned about just who remained, was overheard to remark, I never heard of anything so ridiculous. If you want a lamb and a tiger to live in the same forest, you don't try to make them communicate. You cage the bloody tiger.
So this is the every one of his stories has a moral. So this is some morals, and then maybe some questions to ask.
The friendly forest. Reasonableness is the natural manure of terrorism. Discussion questions for the friendly forest. 1. Why do the animals excuse the tiger's nature, yet try to make the lamb adapt? 2. Would they ever ask the tiger to leave? 3. If the tiger eats the lamb, whose fault will it be? 4. Is the tiger inherently evil or just doing what comes naturally? 5. In what way could the tiger be seen as the symptomatic member of a family? 6. Should the intrusive party ever have equal rights? 7. When dealing with uncompromising forces, are peace and progress ever compatible? 8. In what ways does a consensus orientation always give strength to the extremists? 9. How do you establish criteria in order to know when not to escalate and when to say, I've had enough? And 10, to what extent is evil or any disease an independent force? And to what extent are its destructive effects the result of immunological failure?
I would say that some these Friedman fables, if you can get a copy of it, it's a great exercise to work with church councils, just to kind of read a story and discuss discuss the questions. Friedman's fables, those are the copy, and then the failure of nerve, and then you can also find a lot of the stuff on Bowen, Bowen, Murray Bowen. He's the guy that developed family systems, and Friedman kind of expanded upon it.